The situation in Ukraine has gone from bad to worse, and today President Biden put it bluntly. He says Vladimir Putin will invade.
Do you have any indication about whether President Putin has made a decision on whether to invade?
As of this moment, I'm convinced he's made the decision. We have reason to believe that.
You are convinced that President Putin is going to invade Ukraine. Is that what you just said a few moments ago?
Yes, I did. Yes.
So is diplomacy off the table then?
No. Until he does, diplomacy is always a possibility.
Today was the second time this week the president addressed the world about Ukraine. It's the first time he's been this definite about it, though he insisted that it is not too late for diplomacy. That is why Vice President Kamala Harris and Secretary of State Antony Blinken are in Munich. A three-day security conference there is aimed at addressing crises like this. Vice President Harris is also scheduled to meet with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky tomorrow. It's still unclear whether he'll come. U.S. officials are concerned that it's too risky right now for him to leave Ukraine and that Mr. Putin might exploit his counterpart's absence. Secretary Blinken is still planning to meet his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, next week, presuming Russia does not attack Ukraine before then. Let's begin with more on the view from the White House. NBC senior digital White House reporter Shannon Pettypiece starts us off tonight.
President Biden gave the clearest indication yet that he believes Russian President Vladimir Putin has made a decision to invade Ukraine. The president also added that he believes that invasion could include an attack on Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, a city of millions of people. Now, the president said he was still leaving the door open to diplomacy, that there was still a path for Putin to come to negotiation and make a diplomatic offer and solution to de-escalate this crisis, but that he felt that was increasingly likely and an invasion could come in the coming days. The president gave a little bit of a timeline in his remarks for diplomacy. He said there's a planned meeting on February 24th between the Secretary of State and his counterpart in Russia. If Russia is to invade before that date, the president said essentially the door to diplomacy would then be closed. The president in his remarks today also said and reiterated the united front coming from the U.S. and the Western allies and the members of NATO in responding should Russia carry out what appears to be an inevitable attack on Ukraine. The president said that the U.S. would impose severe sanctions on Russia and that the allies would be united in that response. But clearly, the grimmest assessment we have heard from the president in this White House yet about the likelihood of an invasion of Ukraine by Russia.
Thank you, Shannon. That was NBC's Shannon Pettypiece starting us off tonight. Now, Russia claimed that it has withdrawn troops from Ukraine's border. The U.S. says that has not happened and that, in fact, the number of Russian troops has increased from 150,000 to 190,000. Something else that's adding to the sense of foreboding is that Russia says it wants to start running a series of nuclear drills tomorrow. Meanwhile, shelling in eastern Ukraine has sparked fears that the fighting there is a preview of things to come. Eastern Ukraine is a place where people are very familiar with the cost of war, particularly that little stretch of green right where Ukraine and Russia border. Ukrainian soldiers and Russian-backed separatists have been fighting there since Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. And the fighting that began there yesterday has not let up. From our partners at Sky News, Chief Correspondent Stuart Ramsey is on the ground in Ukraine.
Even main roads are part of the battlefield in this conflict. For 2 days, this Ukrainian position has been hammered with rockets fired from separatist lines further up the road. New debris litters the whole area. The mist adds to the sense of foreboding. This is a scary place, made worse by the sudden quiet after hours of explosions, and the soldiers don't like it.
Це, по-перше, трохи і як страшно, бо тому що якщо затиші, значить вони можуть готуватися до чогось болі, такого якого сильного типу удара.
Bits of rocket lie next to holes in the punctured tarmac, a direct route to the Russian-backed separatists within sniper range. We can't go further than this, these sandbags and this defence position. That road goes right to the separatist controlled area. It's not very far away. What's really interesting, though, these tank traps, they say were targeted, which led them to believe that there's a potential ground invasion of this area being planned. It's never happened before, they were saying. And it's interesting because these lines have been here for years. They very rarely move. And it was the first indicator they've had that actually maybe the separatists and the Russian forces are thinking coming down this road. And of course you can hear explosions around us all the time. We move forward through the mud and snow of the frontline trenches, some lined with wooden planks to stop the trench walls collapsing. Every day now feels much more like World War I. Across this 300-mile demarcation line, rockets and mortars are being fired by both sides. Whatever their leaders say, they are both firing. At the nearest point to the separatist positions, the duty soldiers keep a constant watch. At times, they listen to the firing on other positions, trying to identify the caliber of the incoming rounds. Across this long battlefield, the soldiers all agree that things are ramping up. Things are different now. Everything is more intense.
Да. Было намного больше в этот раз обстрелов, чем перед этим. То есть месяца, наверное, 2 более-менее было спокойней. А вот это со вчерашнего утра то началось более такое ожесточенное, грубо говоря, ну, не нападение, а обстрел именно. Именно работала вот минометка большим калибром. Большим калибром.
Well, it's taken us a long time to get up to this defensive position because the fighting has been so intense. It was really intense when we arrived, and it's been intense, they say, for the last couple of days, and it's really dangerous here. These ribbons here and on this side here indicate that everything on this side and on this side is mined. So there's really only this path and this trench to get in. The soldiers are really concerned that there is actually going to be an attack on them by soldiers rather than what we've seen, which is just the crisscrossing of missile exchange of fire, but an actual attack on their positions. So in their bunkers, they wait for their turn to once again take up guard duty in the trenches. But this is where they retreat when the rockets are falling. In recent days, they've spent a lot of time here. Stuart Ramsey, Sky News, Eastern Ukraine.
Let's continue now with John Herbst. He's a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, and he's the senior director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Ambassador Herbst, welcome back. Good to have you with us.
Nice to be here.
Every account that I've heard today about what the president said suggests that if he's willing to put it in these blunt of terms, the U.S. is past the point of wondering what's going to happen and kind of to the point of hoping that diplomacy wins out. This felt highly definitive for the president to be saying this to the world, knowing that Vladimir Putin will be listening. What was your read on the president's remarks today?
Well, I think you're right. It means the situation has become more serious and more dangerous. But keep in mind, his address was not just to the American people, not just to the people of Ukraine, but also to the people of Russia, and including especially the president of Russia. And I think he was trying to do 3 things with those remarks. First, he was saying there's a good chance, maybe a very good chance, but not an inevitability that Putin is going to strike large into Ukraine. Secondly, he was saying we know it and we are prepared, and we are going to hit you very hard, not militarily, but with our sanctions, with prepping up, putting more NATO forces up against your border, which will be a geopolitical challenge to you, but also with arms to Ukraine. And finally, he was saying, we can anticipate your next move, so maybe you want to think twice, and diplomacy is still available. So Biden still left clear that this can be resolved without another major Russian military strike on Ukraine.
What do you make of how the situation has evolved in eastern Ukraine? One of the big concerns has been that something would pop off in the Donbass region, right near the east-west border that Ukraine and Russia share, that would become sort of the pretext for Russia to say, see, there, that's why we're moving in. Does what happened this week feel like that pretense, or is that something else?
I think one of the reasons why Biden believes that they've made the decision to go in is precisely these Russian shenanigans in the East. Before Russia went into Georgia in 2008, local forces that they controlled in southern Ossetia, which is part of Georgia, fired into Georgia, which is controlled by the government of Tbilisi. When the Georgian soldiers fired back at southern Ossetia, the Russians claimed that Georgia had committed a provocation, and then they launched their own invasion. So I think it's pretty clear the Russian-controlled forces in eastern Ukraine are trying to provoke a Ukrainian response, which they can then use to say, okay, now you deserve us to come in. We are only responding to your provocation. So this is a traditional Russian move, and this is why, again, one of the reasons why Biden thinks they've made the decision to go. But Ukraine did not bite on this trap, and Moscow still has nothing to point to if they decide, again, to launch a second invasion of Ukraine.
And just for those who aren't, it didn't show on the map, by the way, but for those of you who aren't real familiar with the area, you can see Ukraine is just west of Russia. Georgia is south of Russia, but they do also share a border. What do you think, Ambassador, in terms of how Kyiv and Ukraine would handle a Russian invasion? I mean, that piece from Stuart Ramsey was really chilling in terms of just what it's like along the border right now. Do you believe the Ukrainians are ready to fend Russian forces off?
Russia has by far the strongest military in Europe. Ukraine's military is competent, but Russia's is much more powerful. If Russia decides to send all or most of those 190,000 troops into Ukraine, they'll be able to achieve pretty much any objective they want, meaning seizing territory. But they will face a lot of casualties because the Ukrainians will fight and fight hard. There's not the Afghan army, which collapsed in a matter of weeks over the summertime. And that's a serious problem for Putin. Because one, the Russian people don't want Russian soldiers fighting Ukrainians. And secondly, they'll be very unhappy if Russian soldiers come back dead. So this is a problem for Putin. He can succeed in his immediate objectives, but a lot of Russian soldiers will die, and that's a vulnerability.
So let's talk about what might happen. President Biden has talked about sanctions. He talked about sanctions in his remarks today. Give me a sense of what you think those sanctions might actually do if Russia decides to invade. I presume that if Vladimir Putin decides this is something he's going to do, he's considered the cost of it and decided that the cost is not a good enough reason for him not to invade. So if he does, what's the point of sanctions?
I agree with what you've just said, but with a little bit to add. Whether or not Putin has decided to go in, and I'm not sure he has, he recognizes that this will be very painful for the Russian economy, and very painful, especially for people around him, and that this will be a political liability for him at home. I am confident that there will be sanctions at a minimum on one or two Russian banks. There will be export controls, which will make it very hard, for example, for Russia to do things involving high tech, which will also be a serious degradation of Russian economic potential, a major fall in the Russian standard of living. So these are all things that are not good for Putin's political standing at home. He may yet decide to go in, but sanctions are a major consideration for him. And if he doesn't go in, that plus the plus-up of NATO forces along Russia's border, and also the clear information campaign the U.S. and our friends are conducting, meaning pointing out what Russia may do, especially the false flag operations, will be the reasons why they don't go in.
And forgive me, Ambassador, I'm gonna be the guy to ask the dumb question because we throw this term sanctions around a whole lot. Just to make sure we're all clear on what we're talking about, it sounds like what you're saying is that in response, parts of the world economy will say, you know what? Okay, if this is what you want to do, we're not going to do business with you. Good luck shoring up that hole in your economy with somebody else, and put economic pain on Russia to the point where it realizes its interdependence with the rest of the world system and does what it has to do to get back in the world's good graces. Do I have that right?
That's right. The sanctions that we currently have on Moscow for its current war in Donbass cost their economy 1%, even 1.5% of GDP per year. Biden has said these will be far more punishing. So maybe it'll be 2, 3, or 3% on top of the 1 to 1.5. That's why lots of people in Moscow, albeit maybe not ones making the decision, understand that this would be a catastrophe for Russia.
What about military engagement? The president made it very clear that they are not planning to send troops in Ukraine. That's been the line steadily from the very beginning. NATO troops have moved closer to NATO countries to defend NATO allies. Ukraine is not in NATO. We've had that conversation before. But if these troops are not prepared to become part of the fighting, is the rest of the world kind of crossing its fingers that Ukraine will prevail? Or is the rest of the world sort of assuming Russia would take Ukraine if it invaded? We just have to make sure that doesn't spill over to NATO countries.
Okay, a very good question. First of all, some people in the United States who don't want us to help Ukraine argue we're going to wind up in a war with Russia. That's nonsense. And Biden's made that clear by saying no U.S. forces are going to Ukraine. We're not going to be militarily engaging Russia. So this means that we cannot help Ukraine with the 82nd Airborne, for example. But if Moscow goes in, they're going to have, again, serious casualties. They may be able to seize territory, but holding it's going to also be bloody for them. At the same time, their economy is going to be stuttering, much worse than it is today. And it's going to probably happen that over time, Putin will not achieve his objectives by military means, meaning force Ukraine to change its national security policy. And keep in mind that Putin's objectives go far beyond Ukraine. In the draft treaties that he sent to us 7 weeks ago, he was demanding essentially for the United States and our other NATO partners to pull all weapons and troops out of the new NATO countries that joined at the end of the Cold War. That would give him the ability to coerce NATO members. So we need to stop Putin's aggressive foreign policy in Ukraine, where we do not need to use American soldiers to shed American blood. This is why the United States has a vital interest in helping Ukraine defend itself.
Ambassador John Herbst, I appreciate you helping explain this situation to us. It's moving very fast this week, and I appreciate you helping us kind of put all this in context. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Still to come, former police officer Kim Potter learned her sentence today for killing Dante Wright. Her remorse may have saved her from a much longer sentence. We'll have highlights from today's sentencing and some of your reactions. We're glad you're with us on this Friday for Now Tonight from NBC News. She said that it was a mistake and that she was sorry. That did not spare a former Minnesota police officer from prison, but it did reduce the time that Kim Potter could have gotten. Today, a judge sentenced her to 24 months, but the plan is for 16 months in prison and 8 months of supervised release pending good behavior. Ms. Potter was convicted of first and second-degree manslaughter for killing Dante Wright during a traffic stop last April. She's already served 58 days of her sentence. Dante Wright's family spoke out after the hearing.
Kim Potter murdered my son, and he died April 11th. Today, the justice system murdered him all over again. To sit there and watch, pouring my heart out in my victim impact statement that took so long to write, and I reread it over and over again, to not get a response out of the judge at all. But then when it came down to sentencing Kim Potter, she broke out in tears.
Before the sentencing, Kim Potter spoke to the court and apologized to Mr. Wright's family.
I am so sorry that I brought the death of your son, father, brother, uncle, grandson, nephew, and the rest of your family. I am so sorry that I hurt you so badly. My heart is broken and devastated for all of you. I pray for Dante and all of you many, many times a day.
We got very mixed reactions to the verdict from several of you on social media. Tom tweeted that the sentence was ridiculous. Joshua called it an absolute disgrace. Haley wrote, "I sob for this family and every mother of a black child who was just slapped in the face again." Ray tweeted that he thought this was a fair sentence, adding, "I'm sure it was not intentional." And on Facebook, Patty wrote, "Listen to the judge's full explanation on how she came to her decision. I found it very helpful. The sentence is less than I had expected, but I think fair. Let's get more on this from NBC's Shaquille Brewster. He has more from Minneapolis.
The family of Dante Wright walking out of that courtroom extremely disappointed and very emotional after that sentence earlier today. His father saying that he felt cheated by the sentence. His mother saying that today the justice system murdered her son. Judge Regina Chu giving that 2-year sentence after Kim Potter was found guilty on first and second degree manslaughter in the killing of 20-year-old Dante Wright. And we heard from the prosecution arguing for 7 years in prison. They even brought up members of Dante Wright's family who came up and gave emotional testimony, emotional victim impact statements. The defense, on the other hand, they were arguing for probation. We heard from Kim Potter apologizing to the family of Dante Wright and to the larger community here in the Minneapolis area. The judge in the end of that hearing saying that Dante Wright's life mattered, but became visibly emotional. Actually explained her decision, saying that this was about a cop who made a tragic mistake.
Officer Potter made a mistake that ended tragically. She never intended to hurt anyone. Her conduct cries out for a sentence significantly below the guidelines.
Potter will serve 16 months in prison, but will get credit for the nearly 2 months she's already spent behind bars.
All right, let's update you on a few of tonight's other headlines, beginning with COVID. Cases, hospitalizations, and deaths are dropping in nearly every state. And that is raising a question we've waited a long time to ask. Do I still need a mask? The CDC says yes, you should wear a mask in public indoor spaces, vaccinated or not. But the agency plans to update its guidelines as early as next week. Now remember, the CDC sets guidelines, not mandates, but many states are letting their mask mandates expire. Some major events are too, including the Academy Awards. Nominees and guests will have to show proof of vaccination. Presenters and performers will not, but they have to get COVID tests. According to the New York Times, guests sitting up front in the orchestra seats will not have to wear masks, probably because they might be on camera. But guests up in the mezzanine, they might. Now, most Americans are already vaccinated, but if you're ready to get your shot, we can help. Go to planyourvaccine.com or grab your phone and scan the QR code on the screen. Scan it right now. That's planyourvaccine.com. If baby formula is on your shopping list, listen up. The FDA is warning against using some powdered formulas after complaints of contamination. All of the complaints are linked to an Abbott Nutrition facility in southern Michigan. The FDA is investigating 4 infant illnesses potentially related to this contamination and possibly 1 death. Now, the warning covers Similac, Alimentum, and Elecare powdered formulas, only powdered, not liquid. You can see the details on your screen for which products are affected. Now, Abbott is recalling these products, and you can check to see if yours is affected online at Similac Recall, all one word, similacrecall.com. Now, even without this recall, major chains like CVS and Walmart and Target were already dealing with shortages of formula. According to the market research firm IRI Worldwide, out-of-stock levels are at 25% this month. The firm says anything over 10% is concerning. If you're a parent or a caregiver who's affected by this recall, we'd love to hear from you. Leave us a voicemail, 888-575-2NBC. That's 888-575-2622. Or email us now tonight at nbcnews.com. Racial reckoning. What does that actually mean? And what should one look like? Institutions across the country are looking inward, exploring the racist tendencies in their pasts. And not just within law enforcement, banks, universities, and now some of the biggest newspapers in the country. This week, the Philadelphia Inquirer released the first chapter of a special project. It looks back at the newspaper's relationship with the city's black population. It's called Black City White Paper. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Wesley Lowery wrote the piece, and it's edited by Aaron Haynes, editor-at-large of The 19th News. The The project looks back at how the Inquirer's overwhelmingly white newsroom covered Philly and how it treated its black reporters. Now, the Inquirer's leadership has pledged to be an anti-racist institution. The piece reads in part, quote, whether and how a newspaper that for generations has remained complicit in systemic inequality can now be a collaborator in its defeat is significantly less clear. What is apparent is that it will be impossible for the paper to navigate the challenges of the present, much less chart a path into the future, without first understanding its past, unquote. Perhaps this is a new model for what a racial reckoning can achieve. But what does that take? And is it too late to win the trust of black Philadelphians? Joining us now is MSNBC contributor Erin Haynes. Along with her work at the 19th News, she sits on the board of the Lenfest Institute for Journalism. That is the nonprofit that owns the Inquirer. Erin, good to see you. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Joshua. I apologize for my appearance here, but I'm fresh off a plane, but was really excited to be talking about a more perfect union. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for amplifying the work that we've done on Chapter 1.
That's okay. I appreciate you making time. Like, as soon as I read it, I was like, I got to talk to Erin about this, partly because you have been in Philadelphia and understand the black community there. I used to live in Philadelphia very briefly, so part of me, first of all, just kind of wonders what the reaction to this has been like. Is it still kind of percolating? Have people taken notice? Like, what's the initial reaction been?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it depends on who you ask, right? Certainly a lot of people in our industry have taken notice of the piece, have taken notice of the fact that the Inquirer opened themselves up to outside inquiry, right? I mean, you have had certainly other newspapers to kind of reckon with their history, with their past. The Baltimore Sun today just did a 4,000-word op-ed on, apologizing for their role, really, in perpetuating inequality and working to perpetuate racism against Black Marylanders. But that was written, that was an inside job for all intents and purposes. That was written for and by people at the Baltimore Sun. What the Inquirer did, which felt different, was to say, hey, we are open to you, Erin, as somebody who is not at the Inquirer, and Wesley, somebody who is not at the Inquirer or in Philadelphia, to take a look at the 190-plus year history of this newspaper, but also its present, and whether and how this newspaper is continuing to perpetuate inequality. It is one of the oldest newspapers in America, but on the other side of the 2020 racial reckoning, they said that they wanted to be, as you mentioned, an anti-racist institution, which is not something that you hear from a lot of newspapers. And so you can't get there without acknowledging that past and reckoning with that past. And frankly, that is work that should be ongoing, but that not everybody in our profession is continuing to do. But the Inquirer certainly is saying that they are committed to that work, and they understand that they are just at the beginning of that process.
Yeah, I didn't know about the Baltimore Sun thing. I'm just looking at the editorial very briefly. Near the top, it reads in part, quote, we bore witness to many injustices across generations, and while we worked to reverse many of them, some we made worse, unquote. That's from the Baltimore Sun's editorial piece today. Erin, with regard to kind of that theme in terms of the Philadelphia Inquirer's reputation as a paper for all that clearly didn't act like it over its history, were there one or two of the major crimes, sins of the paper that stood out to you the most, that most needed addressing?
Well, Joshua, what I was really struck by were some of the stories of the Black journalists who were among the first at the Inquirer, and what they endured in trying to integrate the paper, but also in trying to improve the coverage and really improve our industry. Honestly, they were some of the pioneers in our industry when newsrooms began to integrate in the last half of the 20th century. And the indignities that they endured and the issues that they attempted to raise sound so familiar, unfortunately, in 2022. And so hearing those stories, understanding that this is, what happened in 2020 was certainly not new, that we are on a continuum of inequality, and that for the overwhelming majority of the history of the Inquirer, for the overwhelming majority of the history of American journalism, this is an institution that has perpetuated narratives of inequality that have really helped to shape how we think of ourselves as a democracy and a society.
I wonder what the potential impact of this could be. On the one hand, I think, okay, great. Philadelphia Inquirer is willing to fall on its sword, and it has been digging for swords to fall on, like a lot of other papers, the Kansas City Star and the LA Times and others, the Baltimore Sun today. On the other hand, I have to think, when I was living in Philly, I didn't need to go to the Philadelphia Inquirer to know what was going on in Black Philadelphia. This is the Philadelphia Tribune. I could listen to WDAS on the radio. Like, I don't need y'all. Y'all weren't paying attention, so we started telling our own stories. So it's cute that you came around and all, but, like, it's almost too late. Do you think, Aaron, that there's time for the Philadelphia Inquirer to fix this damage, or is it a little too late for that?
Oh, there's absolutely time. And in fact, you know, that time is overdue, which is what we point out in the piece. Yes, absolutely. Philadelphia has a robust ethnic media community. The Black press in Philadelphia is unlike anything I've ever seen. I'm from Atlanta. I got my start in the Black press at a Black newspaper, the Atlanta Daily World. But the support that papers like the Philadelphia Tribune and Black radio get in Philadelphia is really really born out of the reality that the Philadelphia Inquirer did not cover the fullness of the dignity and humanity of Black Philadelphians, and has yet to fully do so. And, you know, I have to say that it matters, Joshua, because the Philadelphia Inquirer is the paper of record here. And so if things are not, you know, if covered in the paper of record, it's not that they didn't happen, but it does say something about what that newspaper values, the choices that they are making about who gets to be a Philadelphian, who gets to be seen as a Philadelphian in the newspaper on an everyday basis. And definitely Black Philadelphians are fully aware that their lives have, you know, good, bad, and otherwise have not, well, actually, no, that's not true, mostly bad, have been reflected in the pages of that newspaper, and it's something that needs to change.
Briefly, before I have to let you go, what happens now? So this report comes out. Are there more steps in this process, or is this report the end of it?
So our excavation of the Inquirer was chapter 1 of a year-long project that we are doing at the Inquirer, A More Perfect Union, which I conceived of in the wake of the racial reckoning, because you know, I really wanted to respond journalistically to what we were seeing, and really feeling like perhaps there was a moment to really reckon with these institutions and to not continue with the status quo that, you know, we were reminded of even in the midst of a pandemic. The dual pandemic of racism was on full display in many institutions across this country. Journalism certainly not immune to that. But, you know, the other thing that really struck me as somebody who's lived in Philadelphia now for the past 7 years, Benjamin Franklin, as you know, Joshua, was prolific, created things like, you know, you say Philadelphia is home to the first hospital, the first university, the first police department, the first penitentiary, you name it. So there are many firsts that started in Philadelphia. And if we acknowledge that and the origin stories that feel good that we like to tell ourselves, we have to also acknowledge the stories that don't feel so good, and the reality that that inequality in those institutions was also born in Philadelphia. But the good news is, you know, Philadelphia is a city that fashions itself as the cradle of democracy, you know, dreamer and creator of big ideas and ideals. And so that is the work, that is the responsibility of us all to carry forward today to form a more perfect union.
And that project is called A More Perfect Union. If you just go to Philly.com, it's right on their homepage, a frighteningly well-reported and well-edited piece of journalism. Aaron Haynes, I really appreciate you making time to talk to us about this. Thank you very much. It's good to see you.
Thank you, my friend.
Hey, by the way, remember to join us next week for our Black History Month special. Black History Now. We'll dig into the controversies over how we teach this history. You may have noticed this week on The Daily Show, LeVar Burton did a sketch about banned books. Guess who's joining us for our special? That's right, LeVar Burton. I'll be speaking to him. We're going to mark the 45th anniversary of the miniseries Roots. And if anything changed the way that America talked about Black history, Roots certainly did. We would love your questions for Mr. Burton and your stories about how his work has affected you. But we need them by this Monday. So send them right away. We're at NBC Now Tonight on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. Leave us a voicemail, 888-575-2NBC, or email nowtonight@nbcnews.com, and join us for Black History Now this Thursday at 8 Eastern here on NBC News Now. And of course, we will keep an eye on the latest in the standoff with Ukraine after President Biden's remarks today, basically calling out Vladimir Putin, saying that he is quite certain that Russia will invade. It's just a matter of time. We're watching Secretary Antony Blinken for whether his meeting with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, will happen at all. Vice President Kamala Harris is in Munich for the Munich Security Conference alongside the Secretary of State. We'll keep an eye on that and keep you posted here and online at NBCnews.com. Busy week. Much more to come on Monday. But until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. Thank you for making time for us. Stay safe this weekend, and we'll see you Monday. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.